Hello and welcome to the National Chinchilla Society YouTube channel. Before we begin, don't forget to visit our website at www.nationalchinchillasociety.co.uk, where you can find lots of information on anything chinchilla related. Also, please watch our other YouTube videos which cover a lot of different chinchilla subjects. Today we're going to explain the fascinating world of chinchilla colour genetics. Genetics can sound complicated at first, but once you understand the basic principles, it becomes much easier to see how different colours and patterns are produced. Let's begin with the original chinchilla colour. Standard grey is the original colour of wild chinchillas in their native South American mountain habitat. However, through many decades of careful selective breeding in captivity, domestic standard grey chinchillas now look very different from their wild ancestors and also now come in a wide variety of colours. The standard grey gene is considered the base gene in chinchillas. It is a dominant gene. It has a strong influence even when paired with other genes. Standard greys are extremely important in breeding programs because they strengthen type, density and fur quality, as well as carrying the original genetic foundation of the species. In this video, some of the pairings are shown purely to demonstrate how chinchilla colour genetics work and are not necessarily the ideal match for breeding high-quality animals. Every chinchilla inherits colour genes from both parents. Each parent passes on one or more colour genes that influence the offspring's colour, pattern, and sometimes even fur type. These genes combine to determine what the baby chinchilla looks like and what genes it actually carries. Because each offspring inherits one or more colour genes from each parent, littermates can sometimes look very different from one another and even from their parents. So how do new mutation colour genes appear? A mutation is simply a natural change in the genetic code. Occasionally, a random genetic variation occurs, producing a new trait such as a different colour. If that mutation is healthy, stable, and can be inherited, breeders may selectively breed from it over generations to establish a recognised colour line. This is how many of the chinchilla colours we know today began. Now let's explain some of the genetic colour terms you are likely to come across. Let's look at the difference between phenotype and genotype. A chinchilla's phenotype is what you can physically see. Its coat colour, markings, belly colour, fur length and overall appearance. At chinchilla shows in the UK, all the chinchillas are judged on their phenotype. Its genotype is the actual set of colour genes it carries, including genes that may not be visible. If we look at the slide, the two standard greys look the same. That means they have the same phenotype. However, their genotype is different since chinchilla B carries the Sullivan-Violent gene, although it's not visible. Now let's look at the main types of colour inheritance, which are dominant, recessive and cumulative genes. A dominant gene only needs one copy from one parent to show itself in the offspring. If the chinchilla inherits that gene, the colour or trait will be visible, even though they still carry the base standard grey gene. Recessive genes work differently. To visibly show the mutation colour, the chinchilla must inherit the same recessive gene from both parents. That means it must be homozygous. If it only inherits one copy, it will carry the gene without showing the colour. If it carries the gene, it can still pass that recessive gene to offspring. However, this is not guaranteed, and until it is proven, then the offspring are normally referred to as possible carriers. Whether a parent will definitely pass on a recessive gene to its offspring will depend on whether it is carrying the heterozygous or homozygous version of that gene. This will be explained in more detail later on. The third type of colour gene in the chinchilla is a cumulative gene, and it's the ebony self-black gene. With cumulative inheritance, the amount inherited influences how strongly the colour is expressed. Generally speaking, the more ebony influence present, the darker the animal tends to be, and the more wraparound belly colour it will have. This means the phenotype can vary greatly. At one end of the scale, an ebony chinchilla may look like a standard grey, but with a slightly muddy or off-white belly. At the other extreme, it may be a fully extra dark ebony animal, with a glossy dark colour extending right around the body and every hair appearing shiny and black. One key point about ebony is that if a parent has the ebony or self-black gene, it will always be passed on to the offspring. This will influence future generations, even when expressions vary. Now, let's explain in more detail what is meant by heterozygous and homozygous colour genes. For example, a heterozygous beige carries only one beige gene and one standard grey gene. A chinchilla is homozygous when it has two copies of the same gene which it's inherited from both parents. For recessive mutations, two copies are required for the mutation colour to appear. For example, for a Sullivan violet to be born, the offspring must inherit that gene from both parents. When a gene exists in a homozygous version, there is no base standard grey gene expressed in the genotype. Hence, that parent will always pass on its mutation gene to its offspring. Therefore, the offspring will either be definite carriers or that mutation, depending on what the other parent carries. The dominant beige gene can also be inherited from both parents, resulting in a homozygous version of this mutation. It is the only dominant mutation gene that can exist in this form. Being dominant, it only requires one beige gene to be inherited from one parent for the colour to appear. Hence, if a homozygous beige is mated with a standard grey, the litter will be 100% heterozygous beige. When you pair two homozygous beige chinchillas, both parents will pass on the beige gene, since neither carries the standard gene. Therefore, all offspring will be 100% homozygous beige. Equally, two Sullivan violets, two sapphires, or two black pearls, or in fact any other recessive mutation, when mated together, will always produce that mutation, since each parent will pass on the gene to the offspring. However, it should be noted that such pairings will not likely produce the best quality offspring, since the base standard gene has been diluted. Although chinchillas come in a wide variety of colours and patterns, there are actually only a small number of colour genes involved. There are in fact only 3 dominant mutation colour genes, which are beige, Wilson white and velvet. There are 6 recessive colour genes, which are the Sullivan violet, the Deutsche violet, low recessive white, also known as the gold bar, the black pearl, the sapphire and the charcoal. Some of these are still relatively rare. It should also be noted that the Sullivan violet and the Deutsche violet genes are not related. There is only one cumulative gene, the ebony or self-black gene. So, with so few colour genes, some of which are quite rare, how are there so many recognised mutation colours? This is because these colour genes can occur in different combinations, and the animals can inherit more than one colour gene from each parent. This gives us the wide diversity of colours that we see today. All three dominant genes, which are velvet, Wilson white and beige, can be combined together in different combinations to produce a number of different mutations. Now let's look at the example of a brown velvet bred to a Wilson white. A brown velvet carries the velvet and beige mutation genes, and the Wilson white mutation gene. Of course, both carry the base standard gene. So what offspring can this pairing produce? The kits could in fact be 8 different colours, and this will depend on which genes or which combination of genes they inherit from both parents. If a kit inherits the beige gene from one parent and the standard gene from the other, it will be a hetero-beige. If a kit inherits the beige and velvet genes from the brown velvet parent and the Wilson white gene from the other, it will be a brown and white cross. And so the possible combination of mutations go on. A Wilson white, a black velvet, a brown velvet, a black and white cross, or a pink white. Of course, since both parents carry the standard gene, they could also produce a standard grey. A blue diamond is the result of combining two recessive colours, sapphire and violet, in its homozygous form. Dominant and recessive genes can also be combined. An ultraviolet is a combination of the Sullivan violet gene in a homozygous form and the dominant velvet gene. Another example is the brown pearl, which is a combination of a homozygous version of the pearl gene plus one dominant beige gene. There are many more examples of mutation chinchillas that arise from a combination of a dominant gene and a homozygous version of a recessive gene. The ebony gene can combine with both dominant and recessive genes. The ebony gene partnered with the beige gene will produce a tan, while the gene, when combined with a homozygous Sullivan violet gene, will produce a violet wrap. Since ebony is a cumulative gene, the phenotype of the offspring will depend on how much of the ebony gene they have inherited. So, in summary, the various mutations you see today are combinations of the 3 different types of genes. It should be noted that sometimes when the velvet gene is combined with other mutation genes, it may not always be obvious to the untrained eye. As examples, an ultraviolet may look like a Sullivan violet and a black and white cross like a mosaic. However, the velvet gene shows up in the phenotype of these by the pore spots on the front leg. This is an indicator that their genotype includes the velvet gene. Breeders should be aware of the 2 lethal combinations of colour genes. The Wilson white gene and the velvet gene are both believed to be lethal in the homozygous form. This means if a baby inherits 2 copies of the Wilson white gene or 2 copies of the velvet gene, the embryo does not develop normally and is not viable. We know this because no confirmed healthy homozygous Wilson whites or homozygous velvet chinchillas have ever been produced. For that reason, responsible breeders do not pair 2 animals that carry the white gene or 2 animals that carry the velvet gene in whatever form that takes. So, for example, a pink white should not be bred with a Wilson white and a brown velvet to a black velvet. It should be noted that combining the Wilson white gene and the velvet gene is not a lethal combination. Understanding these risks is a vital part of ethical chinchilla breeding, as is knowing whether there are any underlying health issues in your herd, such as genetic malocclusion. Now, let's talk about a fur trait rather than a colour trait. the Royal Persian Angora, often shortened to RPA. The RPA gene affects fur length and texture and not colour. So instead of replacing colour genes, it acts as an overlay on top of them. That means you can have an RPA beige, an RPA violet, or any other combination of colours. The colour genetics remain separate. The RPA gene only changes the fur length. When being judged as shows in the UK, the RPA is judged like any other chinchilla in terms of its colour classification, but with the overlay of longer fur length. The RPA gene is a recessive gene, so works in exactly the same way as a recessive colour gene. So animals need to carry the gene in its homozygous form to express the gene in its phenotype, and animals can be carriers. Although it's not covered in this video, it should be noted that the locken or curly chinchilla is a fur trait linked to the ebony gene. Before we finish, let's quickly recap some of the important terms we've covered today. Phenotype means what you can physically see, the chinchilla's visible appearance, such as its colour, markings, belly colour, and sometimes even fur type. Genotype means the genes that the chinchilla actually carries, including colour genes that may not be visible. There are 3 types of colour genes. Dominant, where only one copy of the gene is needed for the colour or trait to be seen. Recessive genes require 2 copies of the genes, one inherited from each parent. Cumulative genes refer to the ebony or self-black gene, where the amount inherited normally affects how strongly the colour is expressed. Heterozygous means the chinchilla carries 2 different versions of a gene pair, such as one mutation gene and one standard, for example, a Wilson white. Homozygous means the chinchilla carries 2 copies of the same colour gene. It should be noted that the dominant beige gene is the only dominant gene that can be carried in a homozygous version. This is, of course, other than the base gene, the standard grey gene. Understanding these key terms makes it much easier to understand chinchilla colour genetics and breeding outcomes. It is important to remember that breeding for colour is only one part of producing a quality chinchilla. Colour genetics can be fascinating, but there are many other traits that are just as important and often more important when planning responsible breeding. These include fur qualities such as density, blueness, clarity, texture and length. A chinchilla may have an attractive colour, but without strong fur quality, it will not represent a quality animal. Size and conformation also matter. Good body size, strong structure, broad shoulders, and overall balance all contribute to a healthier, stronger animal. Health must always come first. Breeders should pay close attention to hereditary issues, including genetic malocclusion and other faults that can affect long-term welfare. Producing healthy animals should always be the priority over producing unusual colours. Temperament is another key factor. Calm, confident, well-natured chinchillas are generally easier to manage and often make better breeding and companion animals. The influence of the standard grey gene should never be underestimated. Strong standard grey lines have historically contributed many of the best fur qualities, including density, clarity, and overall strength of type. These qualities are valuable across all colour mutations. The best animals, irrespective if they are a standard grey or mutation, normally has a strong standard gene influence. So while colour may be the first thing people notice, true quality comes from combining colour with fur quality, sound health, correct conformation, and good temperament. The standard grey, although not a mutation, is often considered the most beautiful colour in chinchillas. If you'd like help predicting colours from a mating pair, the National Chinchilla Society provides a very useful litter predictor on our website. This tool shows what colours may be born from a pairing, along with the appropriate percentage likelihood of each outcome. It is an excellent source of information for breeders, owners, and anyone wanting to understand genetics more clearly. All you need to do is put in the phenotype of the sire and dam and any known recessive gene, or whether or not it carries the ebony self-black gene. You can even overlay it with the RPA gene, and it will predict the outcome of the litter both in terms of genotype and phenotype. You can also use the calculator to research the genetic makeup of all mutations that are recognised in the UK. So please visit our website www.nationalchinchillasociety.co.uk. Thank you for watching.